I'm Marlene Goldman. I'm a professor of English at the University of Toronto, and I'm also a filmmaker. My dad was an architect, and I grew up in Toronto in the 1960s and 70s in the house that he built. And over the years, I watched him design thousands of homes. And he would take us out on weekends to the construction sites that he was working on. And I realized that designs that began on paper took shape in brick and wood and steel. And I learned a fundamental lesson from my father, and it was this: our homes, our communities, and our nations begin and live on in the imagination. And I carried my dad's lesson with me into my work as a literary scholar, and I know that writers, like architects, plot people and places, helping us understand where and how we live. So, the question I want to explore with you is, how have short story writers, particularly Nobel Prize-winning author Alice Munro, enabled us, well, to recognize the nation and in turn let the nation become recognizable to others? And second, why do younger Canadian writers continue to rely on the short story to put their communities on the cultural map? Since the 1960s, Alice Munro has dazzled readers with her accounts of her hometown on the edge of Lake Huron, Ontario. In her loosely autobiographical stories, Munro offers readers glimpses of secrets, crimes, and radical transformations. In one of her short story collections, Lives of Girls and Women, this young girl, Dell, speaks of her hometown, says, "The people in Jubilee, their lives were dull, simple, amazing, and unfathomable. Deep caves paved with linoleum." Munro's stories, in exploring these ordinary and uncanny lives, bend and twist. And you might begin with an ordinary, familiar place, but suddenly, by the end of the story, you're transported to a completely different universe. And there's a story in a very early story collection where a little girl is with her father, who's a traveling salesman, and they're on a country road. And suddenly he takes her off the road, and he takes her to the home of a woman that he might have married. She was the wrong religion. It didn't happen. It's a secret. And the little girl driving back with this secret feels as if her father's life is like the landscape that's rolling out behind them in the car. If you look at it, it seems ordinary, but it's enchanted. And so when your back is turned, it darkens and becomes strange, full of different weather and distances you can't possibly imagine. In another story, a little girl realizes that her father is a shy furniture repairman. He's loved by the community, but when the doors close and on occasion he transforms into a tyrant, king of the royal beatings she received as a child. Taken together, Munro's stories are brutally honest and incredibly brave. Her stories don't promote the view that we'll all live happily ever after. Instead, they insist that life is full of radical, shocking, sometimes supernatural transformations. Even the landscape is changing and in ways, and the environment is changing in ways we can't always fathom. So ultimately, the one thing that Munro's stories insist on is that we can count on change and surprise, sometimes very dark surprises. And so it's a paradox. What's permanent is shock and surprise. And since the 1960s, Munro has been using these very often dark surprises as fuel for incredibly beautiful art. So I'm looking out and I see that most of you were not around in the 60s, so you're gonna have to take my word for it that most people didn't know much about Canadians or how we lived. So I was really lucky. When I was about 10 years old, my family took a trip. We were driving all the way to Florida, and we ended up in Miami, and I was on Miami Beach. And there was a girl a few years older than me, and she comes up and asks me where I live, and I said, Toronto. She said, oh, she's nodding, she recognizes, yeah. Y'all live in igloos. And what was seemingly a kind of mundane act of recognition between two little girls suddenly transformed into a profound moment of misrecognition. And now, as an older person, I realize if you're Native North American, that moment is ongoing and deadly. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor points out that our identities are shaped in part by recognition, its absence, or misrecognition. And so, if an individual or a group receives a picture of itself from another group or an individual or a society that's confining, that's demeaning or contemptible, that picture, that representation can do real harm. And I'm standing here to tell you, and it's funny because we heard people talk about the great novel. I'm here to tell you that it's in fact the short story. And short story writers have played a really vital role in introducing and holding up a mirror to Canadians of new, marginalized, and often stigmatized individuals and communities. So, for instance, outside of Canada, it wasn't unusual that the short story would be used, but James Joyce used the short story collection in Ireland, another colonized nation, to paint a picture of modern, lower-class Irish life. And in Canada, 2 years before James Joyce, in 1912, Stephen Leacock offered a portrait of his hometown of Orillia, Ontario, and it was called Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town, very comic, bunch of short stories. He portrays people from Orillia. He calls them Mariposans, as simple-minded buffoons who are desperate to ape the lifestyles of people who live in real cities like New York and London. In much more serious and complex ways, Alice Munro follows in the footsteps of Stephen Leacock, also trying to capture a small town life in the grip of modernity and transformation. And so Munro's stories, and they captured me as well, they came at a time when people had to invent, especially women, and continually we have to do this, we have to invent new identities and new stories for ourselves. And in the process, we have to reject, and I think some speakers spoke so movingly about that, identities that were out there for us. And specifically, many people had to break prevailing moral codes. So in a story, and this is the title of the short story collection, Dance of the Happy Shades, the title story, Munro offers a seemingly mundane event in a small town. It's a piano recital, and all the mothers and kids have gathered, and the moms, everyone's bored. They know they're going to hear the same unmusical children pound out familiar ditties. And when the first boy is playing piano, suddenly in walks a parade of children from the Green Hill School. And the room is silent, and everyone's aghast, because this is a school for cognitively challenged children. And the narrator, who's a young child, recognized some of the children seem to have unfinished features. They have slanting eyes. So these are a group of kids with Down syndrome and other cognitive challenges. And at the recital, one of these children, Dolores, plays. And she plays so beautifully. And she is so musical that the room is silenced. And after she's finished, all the mothers really wish that they can kind of regain their sense of superiority, but they can't. And the narrator says, it's the dance of the happy shades that prevents us, that one communique from the world where Miss Marsalis lives. So the world that Munro offers us is a world where non-neurotypical kids can mingle with neurotypical children. It's a world where there's compassion, and Munro is invested in unhiding the hidden. So to give you a sense of how radically new it was to kind of portray kids with disabilities, you have to understand that at the time when the story is set, people were told immediately on the birth of this kind of a child to put that child in an institution. It would never learn, couldn't be taught, probably would not talk. The other point I want to make is that Munro had virtually no literary examples for a picture of a child, let alone a group of children with disabilities. So there was The Sound and the Fury by Faulkner in 1929, or Of Mice and Men in 1937, John Steinbeck. So why would Munro think to offer a new picture of Canada, and that picture include people with disabilities? Well, one reason is that she grew up in a house with an ailing mother in a very poor farming community, and that farming community was devastated by the Depression. When Munro was 9 years old, she was looking after her family because her mom had a disease that hadn't been diagnosed yet, and it was Parkinson's. So at 9 years old, Munro was doing the chores in the place of her mother. The roles were reversed, and she was kind of looking after her siblings. So Munro, as the eldest child, as a girl, should have stayed home, should have looked after her mom until her mom died, but instead, she got a scholarship. She went to Western Ontario, the University of Western Ontario, and in her second year, she got married and moved further away. So the care of her mother fell to her sister and then to her father, who looked after his wife with the help of his mother and whatever relatives were willing and friends were willing to help out. So in her autobiographical story, The Peace of Utrecht, which is set in a house, the family home, a woman comes back after being away and her mother has died, and she's confronting her sister, and they're thinking about their teenage years when they were so ashamed and so humiliated by their mother. And the narrator remembers how her mother's eyes, because of the paralysis caused by her disease, would roll back in her head, or her voice would thicken, and it was inaudible, and they had to translate what the mom was saying to outsiders. So they did their best to keep her hidden away in this house because she didn't belong. And the narrator says, as an older person, we should have let the town have her. It would have treated her better. So, without minimizing the narrator's responsibility for entrenching stigma, and without minimizing the challenges, Munro's stories offer glimpses of alternative worlds. And these are worlds where people with challenges are kind of embraced or treated better. And in the process, Munro's stories demonstrate that we're all vulnerable. And in fact, even the landscape is vulnerable to transformation, degeneration, and humans and the environment are fragile. So, you know, this is an important lesson that contradicts the notion of progress and perfection. And so in a story, in an early story, Munro has a dad come down, you know, take his kid out after dinner and say, hey, let's go see if the lake is still there. And he's joking, but what he wants her to do is understand that the lakes had a beginning in the Ice Age. And he demonstrates with his hand how the ice came down and carved out the sort of basins of the Great Lakes. And the kid is just so flipped out at thinking that, you know, everything wasn't the same. She retreats into this idea that life is permanent and she's safe. But what we know from Munro's stories is that the things that we believe are permanent, our homes, our friends, our parents, these are all ephemeral. They're all capable of changing. In a later story, and this is actually from the final collection of short stories about her home, View from Castle Rock, Munro tells the story of coming to her father when he's in his final illness, and he's lying on his bed, and he is feverish, and he says, you know what, hon? We got it all wrong. We got the wrong end of the stick about evolution. I think what's coming is a new dark ages. And he mouths the word wonder. You'd think a man would be terrified, but he thinks about what's this transformation as a kind of wondrous thing. And as I suggested, Munro has been using this idea of kind of maybe decline or generation as a way of acting as a fuel for creativity. So she says in an interview, you know, with me, writing has always been a fight against death, the feeling that we lose everything every day. And in another story, Material, which is Munro talking about the short story, she's referring in the story, it's a character is thinking about a writer of short stories and says, oh my God, what this person can do, it's an act of magic. It's an act of special, unsparing, unsentimental love. And I'm going to suggest that Munro has given us both a form and a picture of ourselves. And I don't want to leave you thinking that it was just Munro. I want to suggest that new writers, new Canadians, including Dion Brand, Eden Robinson, Madeline Thien, and Suvankam Themavogsa are doing the same thing. And so I hope when someone comes and asks you where you're from, you will tell them, I'm from Munro country. And you'll give them a short story of your choice, or better yet, write one yourself. Thank you.